values to valued culture, here is your host, Will Scott, interviewing another CEO about leading culture in their company.
Welcome everybody to another of our CEO interviews where we interview CEOs about their corporate culture. Here at Czars, we want to help employees feel like they make a meaningful contribution through the work they do and feel valued. We do this by encouraging companies to not just have core values, but to truly have a valued culture. We are en route to creating 2020 Culture Czars by 2020. And today we are interviewing Culture Czar Pete Miles of Miles Performance Consulting. Pete and I are friends, known each other for a long time. Actually went to college together a long time ago, didn't we, Pete, in the UK? So I'm going to let Pete go ahead and introduce himself and his illustrious career in the automotive industry with brands like BMW and Rolls-Royce. Really excited to get Pete's insight on culture today. He's worked it big and small. And Pete, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your career and how you got to where you are today.
Hi, Will. Anyway, it's good to be here and good to talk to you again. And as you mentioned, we started off, I hate to mention it, I think 35 years ago.
Yeah, but you did. You had to mention it, didn't you? Cheers, mate.
To mention it. Retired at the grand old age of 55 and started a new venture in what I call modern automotive retailing under the umbrella Visionary Automotive Group, which is a private capital company that's investing in automotive retail from the ground up. So we're involved in investing in new AdPoint premium franchises and, very importantly, setting a new standard for the culture in those organizations and the operations away from the traditional automotive retail model. So a long way from John Deere tractors these days.
So everything from commercial equipment, agricultural equipment. You've done a startup in Africa. You have a pilot's license, and you've worked. You mentioned Ford, Land Rover, BMW, and Rolls-Royce. So pretty great breadth there, and you've probably seen all kinds of corporate cultures in doing that. So as we kind of go into, and thanks very much for the introduction. When we talk about corporate culture, what does that mean to you?
Well, to me, it means, I wouldn't say I started off having a particular perspective on this. It means why people are here in your company of people and how they will do what they will do. Because really that culture affects the feeling that people have, whether it's from within the company or the people that they interact with from a consumer perspective or B2B. So in that sense, it's the why, how, and what engine room of a business, I would say, of any business.
Yeah, interesting that you should use the word feeling. I had an interview just like this with a different CEO earlier today, and she also talked early on about it's a feeling. And do you think CEOs and leaders of companies pay enough attention to feelings and the way their employees feel? And then the importance of that, or the softer side of business, or is it all about, the bottom line?
Well, I think the answer to that question is as diverse as the industry or the leader of that corporation that exists. So I think it's everything from one end to the other. I think culture corporate culture is extremely important to some companies. And I think a lot of the time when you have mature companies, it can fall into two camps too. It can be a very strong culture that they refer to because they recognize it as leading to the success of their business. Or it could be much weaker because the company generally feels that their products speak for themselves. And it's less about how they do what they do than just the desire for the product. So I think really the range varies, but I think the value of very well defined and leveraged core values or corporate culture is extremely powerful to outperforming your competition.
Yeah. Would you say that managing your culture is as important as managing, the brand or the product strategy? Where you rank managing culture with managing, say, product strategy or brand management? I mean, how important is it?
Well, I think it's to me, it's one of, if not the most important thing, because it's sort of the fabric, the prioritization, and the context behind which you do everything, right? It's like the check and balance for how you do things. There's an expression, there's 101 ways to skin a cat. Maybe that isn't the best one to use in America. But there's always a different way of doing things. The way that's most effective is the one that's getting you compound interest, right, on everything you're doing, or the bigger the organization, the more important it becomes that there's a sort of consistency to the way you do things that is consistent with your product, whether it's a service or otherwise. So I think, certainly in my experience, culture or core values or company values are not always at the top of the priority in terms of the overall strategy. So I think a lot of companies, the strategy revolves around the long, medium, and short-term view of the financial strategy of the business, not so much the people strategy, the software. So the hardware more than the software. Right.
And there's of course, the thesis too that if you don't manage your culture specifically, you'll end up with a default culture, whatever it sort of morphs into. And so just again, emphasizing the importance of managing culture to get the outcome that you want. And why not? Why not have a culture that you love as opposed to one that just develops by default?
Yeah, really, you want one that's energizing for everybody that's involved with the brand, so to speak, or the business. One of the things I found fascinating when I first came to the US and joined Land Rover North America, they used to have an expression about when you went through their training internally or externally, we're going to take the brain out and put the Land Rover cabbage in. And this was kind of one of my first exposures to at least a brand that had a very powerful culture and a set of core values, but really they wanted you to leave behind everything you knew before. Not that what they were going to instill in you was necessarily fundamentally different, but it revolved around their processes revolved around their company core values. And that bled and was taught in any curriculum, internally and externally. And if you didn't fit in that, if it wasn't in your kind of learning thus far to join, you didn't last that long because you didn't fit.
That's a great example of the stuff that we kind of preach at Culture Czars. How did the Land Rover do that, and who was the champion of that and made it part of recruitment through people getting fired? Well, so, in terms of the process to arrive at the core values, so that was done before I got there. But in terms of their process, I mean, it started off, having developed core values for the brand, which for them was guts, authenticity, supremacy, individualism, and guts. So they're probably one of the few companies that I've worked for, of the many, that actually had very clearly defined values. And the principle of how to leverage those things was in any process or any changes that you were making, or if something wasn't working in a process and you needed to make it more efficient or more effective, or reduce the cost of the overhead cost, or whatever you were trying to apply to it. Any changes you were making to the way the company functioned, you had to check against, are we making gutsy decisions, or are we making the easy decision? Are we tailoring the process or the system to the individual needs of our customers? Supremacy in that sense was about the capability of the vehicle, but it was also about the quality of the solution. So those values, as I said, whatever curriculum they were teaching, were part of
part of meetings, where if you were having a management meeting or any kind of meeting with other people to solve problems or look for ways of producing more profit or happier customers, then the core values were kind of the acid test. Does that resonate with some or all of our core values? And if it didn't, or if the argument was against it, you didn't do it that way. You'd have to keep looking for a better solution. So it's from the top down, bottom up. It was part of the thinking.
So you clearly remember very well at Land Rover, which was several years ago now, but the memory is strong in your mind. And the fact that you used words like guts, in everyday language, showed that the core values were really truly a part of the living culture.
Well, it's one of those things where, for me, going through business life in different countries and different areas of even the US, you kind of, if you're open-minded and you're looking for solutions, or you're looking to grow businesses or grow customer bases, you're always trying to learn what's effective. And I remember in the first year, certainly at Land Rover as a business, I remember thinking, God, if only I had known what I'm recognizing here as valuable principles to running a business or growing a business. And that's why it sticks with me so much. And I can tell you that in some aspects of developing a corporate culture, they're one of the best I've seen. On the one hand, on the other hand, maybe the execution, when you look back, could be better. And some companies who don't have such clear corporate cultural values may be better at system and process change anyway to produce greater results. But certainly when you can get the right people working in a consistent direction to affect the relationship with your customers, then I think it's extremely important.
So did you extend the culture downstream to the customers?
Yes. So again, I think if I contrast with different business situations, that's not always true. But if you say, well, how is having an effective culture the most impactful? Then it has to flow in all directions. People have to feel like they're part of it and want to be part of it. And and yes, in those instances with Land Rover as a particular brand, then there were customer events that were conducted much more so than in other businesses I've seen. That again, those mark values were part, the consumer-facing part of them having some fun. Because actually, the mark value I missed, or the core value that I missed, was fun, right? Too. So yes, it was really, through any interaction, internally and externally, there was some leg that was exposing people generally.
That's absolutely fantastic, and the proof is in the pudding. It worked. At Cultures as Ours, we like to say, to encourage leaders to think of themselves leading a culture, not just a company, so that they really are extending the culture and the core values and so on beyond simply the four walls of the company, downstream to customers, upstream to vendors. And now you're leading something much more big and purposeful than simply a company. And of course, you're hopefully working with people that fit, and you're selling to people that fit. And I know the Land Rover experience was a term that was used, right, throughout everything as well, including the deal.
Yeah, the Land Rover way actually is what the stock definition was for everything we do at the Land Rover way. And if somebody said, well, what's the Land Rover way, or and I think it's true for any business, somebody should be able to ask, what's your way of doing business, besides what's the product that you sell or service? And that's really the mortar between the bricks, I think, in a lot of businesses. And it's the effect of compound interest. You get a lot of people thinking this in a similar way, when there's always a 360 degrees direction you can go in with business or as an individual. And this actually helps corral the thinking into a more defined channel focus.
I learned from reminders.
Is there a specific, Pete, is there a specific story that you remember that you can share with us from Land Rover when somebody used a core value to make a point or?
There's actually so many. It'd be hard to pick on one specifically off the top of my head, other than the recollection that on so many occasions when you were discussing solutions, that you would either be asked how it fits in with our company's core values, and you'd have to, because when you have 5 things that you're saying represent a company, whether it's trust as an example, then and you're developing a warranty system or a customer service experience, how does that resonate with trust, right? And so in those instances, in an instance like that, it would basically be that instead of needing to be escalated to solve a customer issue, that the person facing the customer could have the flexibility to decide how and what to do there. So whether it was a potential cost implication of $50 or $5,000, that they had the responsibility to actually solve that problem quickly. Whereas in other companies, I could tell you, you'd have to go through a whole escalation and sign-off process for that. But it depends upon having the right people in the right places, right? So if you don't, then you can't open a checkbook up to say it's your decision, you're the one listening to the facts, so just do whatever's right. So it really is about, but if you know you've got people that carry that burden of responsibility on their shoulders to be diligent, as well as recognizing the culture and values of the customer, then it's okay. But that kind of example was typical. And then another place I could give you the converse of that for some of those things. So
actually, so please do that. Feel free to go ahead and tell us about an experience in one of your other companies that you've worked in.
Well, just to keep in the theme of customer service, in other brands, and I'm not going to mention which ones they aren't necessarily, but you would, if a customer had an issue, and they might come through to me at some point, as when I was more senior in the company, and you'd hear the terrible experience that somebody had and wonder how it had got so out of control. And when you dig into it, there would be checks and balances along the escalation process, depending on how severe it was. Which, in a sense, when you think about it, the worse experience you've had, the more you have to go through to get the bigger, not necessarily compensation, but reaction that's relevant to the level of poor experience that you had. The harder you had to work for as a customer. So in that sense, those a lot of businesses, as part of certainly bigger companies have to have a lot of policies in place to protect things from going wrong. So checks and balances, but at the same time, they can often be speed bumps that are actually inconsistent with
absolutely
the values of the company. And then you're either excusing them because it's company policy, or you're challenging them because it's not serving the customer and one of the core values of the business. Now, if you don't have a core value that's trust or service, then it doesn't matter. You can say you want to have great customer satisfaction and loyalty, but it's actually not something that the systems all have to resonate with that support that business, because you haven't got it as a core value.
Yeah, no, completely understand that. It's and I guess it's probably harder in larger companies to have core values and be consistent with them throughout the organization without those checks and balances. But for sure, if you can be consistent and can have core values and act according to them, which really is the only way, then the company is going to perform better and the customer is going to get better service.
Well, everything gets better when you have a well-defined values of a customer for business, because it's the same as if you have them personally. If you don't notice what they are individually, and you don't notice what they are or recognize what they could be as a company, then it's every employee and person for themselves based on their judgment. So that it may be that it's similar, but it may be that it's quite different, and without getting a similarity to the way you build systems, processes, grow sales, service, customer base, you're losing time and potentially not making the most effective use of resource, and that's why I think it's so important to have. And it's certainly in bigger companies. A lot of the smaller companies, when you think of companies like Apple or Google, the ones, and Starbucks and so on, when they were originally started, the entrepreneur had a vision, but they also had a view about how to deliver that vision. A lot of bigger corporations have grown up in quite a different way, or those original founding fathers of that business, those core values somewhere along the line may have just become less of a focus. And then getting back is hard, because the more people you have, the more chance that you have that you've hired people and they've formed habits that are consistent with their own values, but not necessarily the values of the company. So to go back in and fix that, if you want to get exceptional performance from a business, is quite tough, because you have to hope in a way that that not only you can rekindle those values, but that you can establish them, and then get everybody to buy into them and accept that you're going to have to change some things if the habits that the company's formed aren't consistent with the values. So it's, the devil in the deep blue sea.
So if you were to be starting a new company today, or going into a small, let's say, 100-person company or something, and culture was one of the first things you were going to address, so assuming they didn't have any core values, what would you do? How would you start working with that group?
Well, for us in this particular phase of my business life that I'm in, it's critically important. But the good news is we start with a blank sheet of paper, because these are ground-up startups. So they are big businesses, nevertheless, that will be over $100 million in revenue. But in that sense, it makes it easier in a way to not only have established what our core values are for business, the way we want to do business, but recruit people into key positions and throughout the company that without feeding them to them, but actually be able to identify those people that have similar values, value the same things. And so that's kind of a very different thing, but gives us a huge advantage. And I think for any small business that's growing, you're in a much stronger position with a smaller group of people to get to being a bigger company. So we've got them very clearly defined, and so that everybody, as they come on board, will understand the mission to our customers and how we expect them to conduct themselves. And that goes from the top down, bottom up, and also as the systems and processes are being developed.
Yeah, that's very true. I like to remind people that culture is actually one of the few things where you can make a relatively small investment. Right, it doesn't cost a lot to do what you just said, define the core values and communicate those throughout your new organization. Compared to what you're putting into buildings and inventory and all of that, it's a very small expense, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's simply, in that sense, it's about defining what you do and how you do it, and then do what you say. So it's not really, it doesn't have to be cumbersome. And as I said, in terms of, whether any business that has to respect a P&L account, it's how you go about tackling those things that aren't driving enough top line, aren't producing enough bottom line. In that sense, it's part of using a filter to how you accelerate to where you want to go and manage the business as you are going. It brings a consistency to it. And it's like the power of marketing in that sense, the ultimate driving machine. In that sense, there's a brand value, not necessarily a core value, but in that instance, the goal is to have everybody who thinks BMW think the ultimate driving machine. And so a culture of business is the same thing. When people think about your business, my business, is to have them be able to say what it means that is consistent with your core values. And then you're successful at instilling it in your business when people recognize it in the experience.
So based on the experiences that you've had, these different companies with culture, what advice would you give to our subscribers around having a defined culture and how that can help their business succeed?
Well, my advice on this is simple. Ignore developing a clear set of core values and developing a culture in your organization that you'll be proud of at your peril. So it doesn't mean things will necessarily always go bad. People may not have got well-defined core values or well-defined culture that they can see based on those core values in their company. But what I can almost certainly guarantee you is you won't be getting the best out of your business, the best out of your people, and the best out of your customers if you don't have one. It's virtually impossible to do that. So yeah, I'd say ignore them at your peril. Recruit and retain people based on those core values. There's a saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. So it's not that people are bad, whoever works in a company, but if their programming thus far is out of line with the spirit and means at which you go about your business, it's going to be a wonky wheel. And retain. So, that's also about making sure that people are retained, trained, because you'll have a much less stressful environment in a company that has a consistency to it around the core values of the business. It becomes more fun. So I would say ignore it at your peril.
That's awesome advice. Thank you very much. And thanks again for being a part of the Culture Czars series of CEO interviews. Great insights from your interesting and varied career. Definitely going to go and look up that Land Rover case study. That sounds, like they did a really great job there. And congrats on your success, and wishing you all the best with your new ventures. Thank you, Peter.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thank you. And I wish all your viewers a successful future with their business and getting as much as they can out of creating their own culture and their organization to be proud of.
Thank you. And maybe we'll check in with you again when your new ventures have been around a little while. See how you're doing.
Yeah, we're expecting to grow pretty rapidly, so look forward to doing that and giving you a progress report.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe, check us out on the web at cultureczars.com, and we'll see you next time.